Hello, everyone. I'm Mark Plaster, and this is EP Talk, a place where emergency physicians come to talk about things that are important to us. And my co-host today is JD Landon, and my guest today is Felipe Teran. You guys, the ultrasound specialists, I'm an old school guy, so I'm going to get you started off with a couple of questions. And when I hear something I don't understand, I'm going to jump in and try to get you to clarify for all the old dogs like me in the audience. But I suspect there's most people know more about what you're doing than me. So I'm going to just start off. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Felipe.
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Mark and JD, for having me. This is I'm always happy to talk about ultrasound, about cardiac arrest, about TE, and all this fun stuff. So I'm an emergency physician and researcher. I'm at Weill Cornell Medicine in New York City. Been here for it's going to be 3 years and a couple months. Before that, I was at the University of Pennsylvania for about 4 years, the Center for Resuscitation Science, where I did most of my work, or I guess early work in this area with cardiac arrest and resuscitation. And before that, I did train actually here in New York City at Mount Sinai. So I did emergency medicine residency at Sinai, followed by an emergency ultrasound fellowship. It was during that ultrasound fellowship that I developed, obviously, an interest in transesophageal echo that I then sort of connected to this lifelong interest in resuscitation and cardiac arrest specifically. I guess a cardiac arrest scientist, first of all, and I happen to be very interested in the application of echocardiography, and very specifically in the use of transesophageal echo in cardiac arrest. So I do both clinical work as well as some preclinical work that is very exciting. We have a large animal lab at Cornell in collaboration with our friends in the Cornell Veterinary College up in Ithaca. So I spend sometimes up to a week, a month doing experiments up there with our friends and collaborators. So that's me. And I'm originally from Chile. You might, as you might recognize from my accent, I'm from the south, all the way south from Chile. I was born, raised in Chile. I came to the US for residency, and then I was too difficult to get rid of it. So I managed to stay and stick around.
That's great.
Well, that's lucky for us, Felipe. If you need anybody to like bring you food, cater for you while you're up in Ithaca working, just let me know. Happy to take a trip and tag along. That's just really exciting, I think, to see our clinical EM docs getting to do some of that clinical research is really cool. So can I take over, Mark? I've got a million questions for you, Felipe.
I know you do.
Just so many. So just a little more background. He's being modest here. So he was one of the founders of this thing, Mark, called the ResusTEE workshop. And obviously, correct me if I'm saying anything wrong here, Felipe. And they're doing these workshops. They did it just this last year at Philly at ACEP. They're doing these workshops all over the country, getting us knuckle dragging ER docs into resuscitation TE, getting us involved, getting us exposed. And then what I'm really excited about, Felipe, and I hope you'll talk to us a little bit about, is recently he was awarded a K-23 grant to do some really exciting research about ResusTEE in cardiac arrest. And I'm hoping it's going to really pushing things forward for, like we talked about, Felipe, we just did a podcast, Mark and I together, looking at a recent paper on ResusTEE out of Toronto, 23, patient case series. And as you obviously know and have been a part of producing yourself, we mostly have case reports and case series. So I'm really excited about you getting the funding you need to get some exciting research done.
Yeah. Well, thank you, JD. It is true. I just got the official notification from the NIH. So formally, this grant started in January of 2024, and it's a 5-year project. That is specifically to NHLBI, NIH. It's a study designed specifically to evaluate the impact of transesophageal echocardiography in cardiac arrest, both in out of hospital as well as in hospital cardiac arrest. The current work, as part of my K, obviously, is a centerpiece in my research. And my research, as I mentioned earlier, is centered around the study specifically of transesophageal echo in cardiac arrest. Very specifically at this point, at least the K-23 is aimed to quantify or measure specifically the clinical impact, both the hemodynamic as well as clinical in terms of outcomes of intra-arrest TEE. So we're looking at whether when we find that there's compression of the outflow tract during resuscitation, evaluated in real time with TEE, whether that actually changes or leads to a difference in the key hemodynamic parameters intra-arrest that are markers of coronary perfusion. So those are, for us, end-tidal CO2 as the most general one, also indirect, readily available, as well as diastolic blood pressures in those cases where we have arterial lines in place. And so we're looking at those hemodynamic parameters, and we're looking to essentially confirm in a large clinical sample from a multi-center network of standards that we have through this registry, the resuscitative TEE collaborative registry that we have implemented for the last couple of years. And in that multi-center sample, we are hoping to prospectively now validate what we have already confirmed in animal studies, which is that when you compress the left ventricle, as opposed to the left ventricle outflow tract, you get better hemodynamics and you get higher probability of return to spontaneous circulation. As the second piece of the K23 grant, we're going to evaluate the barriers and facilitators. So it's a implementation science piece. The understanding is essentially, the assumption rather, is that even if we are correct and we prove that this intervention actually leads to improvement in outcomes in terms of higher rates of ROSC, ideally higher probability of survival to discharge from the hospital with good neurological outcomes, which is all outcomes that we're tracking and evaluating. And at the end of the day is really what matters. Even if we are able to confirm that, we have learned from many other interventions. And I know that you, Judy, are very interested in ECMO. ECMO is a great example of specifically ECPR, where it is becoming very clear every year with the science coming out that the key piece is not whether it works, but rather how to make it work and how to implement it. So that's the second part. We're going to do a mixed method study using the same large network of centers that are in some way sort of pioneers, kind of early adopters of this modality throughout the country. Have over 35 centers prospectively collecting data through the registry at this point. And using the same network, we're going to try to understand what are those key facilitators, what are those determinants of implementation success, what makes a center a strong high performer in terms of their capability of deploying this modality.
You know, I graduated from medical school the very first year that there was an emergency medicine specialty exam. So that tells you a little bit how old I am, how long I've been doing this. And I've seen plateaus and then kind of quantum jumps in our management of various kinds of things, you know, our management of trauma and developing trauma centers and developing pediatric specialization, pediatric emergency medicine. And it seems as though the specialty has cruised along, and then people like yourself and others who are looking at questions we've all had. Can we do CPR better? You know, we came out with doing CPR, you know, in the 60s. And after a while, when we started saying, well, I'm not so sure this works all that well, you know, and started sort of giving up, in many cases, giving up on it. And it's folks like yourself who took a deep dive and said, you know, I think with the technology that we have today, we can do it better. We can find out why the CPR that I was doing wasn't helping. And suddenly with the new eyes of transesophageal echo, JD and I were talking about this the last podcast, about the minor adjustments in positioning of the hands that change. You're talking about compression of the outflow tract. I had no idea, nor did anyone else, that their CPR, if improperly placed, was doing maybe more harm than good, and certainly not doing what they thought it was doing. And so this is a breakthrough technology. And the reason why when JD started talking to me about this in his ultrasound fellowship a couple years ago, I was saying, you know, this is one of those quantum leaps, if you will. This is one of those steps that's fundamental to what we do. That if we can prove, not only, like you say, you're exactly right. You in your small lab, or maybe your 150 labs, you know, can show that it works. But then the next step is, can you take that and universalize it and get everybody on board that's in emergency medicine? And suddenly, on a quantum level, more people are going to actually be surviving, and you've changed the outcomes of thousands of people. I mean, that's pretty exciting. I congratulate you. Yeah, you have a vision that's worthy.
Well, thank you. I sure hope you're correct in your predictions. I sure hope that that is the case. Yes.
Felipe, will you, because I think there's probably a lot of people who watch or listen to the podcast who have potentially never even seen a probe get dropped, even seen TE used in person in cardiac arrest. Would you just kind of give us a walkthrough of like, what does this even look like for the person who's never even seen one of these done?
By the way, I had one done to me, but I was asleep while.
That's phenomenal. Did you let your fellows and trainees practice?
I don't know some minutes, perfectly honest.
That was a missed opportunity. I'm sure you consented for it.
If I was in the same state, I would have asked to do it.
Right. He would have been.
Well, yeah. So transesophageal echo probe is fairly simple, but yet brilliant and powerful device. Transesophageal echo probes are essentially, at least the way I see them, just an additional probe of your ultrasound machine. And this is how we understanding in terms of its value as a point of care ultrasound application. We are doing resuscitative or focused TE, not comprehensive TE. So what Mark had likely, I assume, was a comprehensive TE for a procedure or for assessment before cardioversion or whatever it was.
Yeah, I had a TIA, and they're trying to figure out how I got clots from one side to the other. So they did a TE and said, "Oh, by the way, you've got a PFO that never healed from infancy." And so anyway, but I just a real practical question: how big is that sucker?
Well, it's similar to, you could think about it as an intratracheal tube, not much larger than an 8.0 French tracheal tube. And it is essentially similar to any endoscopic device. I'm sure you've seen an endoscope, a GI endoscope, or either a bronchoscopy probe. It has two wheels, a controller, a shaft, and then in this case, the piezoelectric crystals, the crystals that actually generate the ultrasound beam, are located in the tip of this probe in the last 2 inches, 3 inches of the probe that can flex, that can bend. So there's in the controller, there are two wheels that provide mechanical flexion of that tip and allow the tip of that probe to be redirected in different angles. And in addition to that, this is probably what makes TE so powerful. They have, you could say, electrical or digital capability of actually steering, moving the angle of the alignment of those crystals at the tip of the probe. So there's something called omniplane, which is essentially two buttons that allow you to rotate the beam. When we do transthoracic surface ultrasound or echo, we can't change that. That's fixed. The direction in which the ultrasound beam is directed. With transesophageal echo, you have the possibility to rotate that beam in 180 degrees. So if you think about it from that perspective, you have the esophagus located in its central cardiac position as a pipe that allows you multiple levels of imaging behind the heart and above the heart and through the major vessels and back actually into the lungs as well. And then we can not only move up and down, basically mechanically advancing or withdrawing this probe, but we can also modify the direction of the tip as well as then modify the direction of the actual ultrasound beam by rotating that omniplane. And so the combination of those mechanical digital movements is what gives us this rather large number of positions that we can use to image the heart. And this is why in cardiac arrest specifically, and we should say that cardiac arrest is not the only application of transesophageal echo.
Sure.
Formally speaking, at this point, as per the latest policy guidelines from ACIP, actually, that lucky to be part of the group that updated those guidelines this last year, I should say. in those guidelines, the guidelines are essentially describing, endorsing the use of TEE in 3 groups: cardiac arrest, both intra-arrest as well as post-arrest; shock, patients that have undifferentiated shock or hypotension, that are intubated and that have inadequate transthoracic window, so we can't get the data that we need. And the third is procedural guidance. So cases like ECMO or transvenous pacemakers, many other endovascular emergency procedures we do in 2024, it makes a lot of sense to guide those procedures in some of the sickest of our patients with this tool. In cardiac arrest specifically, it is because we have this unique ability to control the direction of that beam that we're able to actually cut through the heart in a plane, I should say, that is perfectly, or very well, I should say, aligned with the same vector in which we're compressing the heart. So the images that we obtain specifically in mid-esophageal long axis views or planes with TEE are really uniquely informative as to what's happening with the heart in this enteroposterior plane. And so it's as if you were able to cut the patient in half sagittally while you're doing CPR and inspect in real time what's actually happening with that chest. And this is why I should say I always describe myself as first cardiac arrest scientist, researcher. I'm primarily interested in resuscitation and CPR physiology and other aspects of resuscitation. I'm obviously very passionate and interested in ultrasound and specifically in transesophageal echo, but I'm like actually agnostic as to whether transesophageal echo is really necessary or will be the tool that helps us improve CPR. I know for a fact, based on my own clinical experience, having done several hundreds cases, as well as our research, that it is a unique window to the heart in real time. Whether that helps us learn and change the practice in certain ways, and then maybe not necessarily need it in the future, or it becomes a integral part of every resuscitation, I don't know. The data will tell us that. So I'm agnostic as to whether this is really going to be just a vessel, a vehicle to better understand how we optimize CPR, or will actually be an integral part of the future of resuscitation. And regardless of that, it will continue to be a very valuable tool for many other applications in emergency and critical care, as we mentioned, like cannulating somebody in ECMO. If you've been part of one of those, it just makes no sense to try to do it percutaneously with no guidance. It would be literally just, in my mind, irresponsible. You're doing it with fluoroscopy in the operating room. Why would you not have a similar standard of safety when you're doing it in the field or when you're doing it in the emergency department? And so TEE allows us in that regard to ensure that we deliver that same standard of care for some of those applications.
JD, I'll give you the last 2 minutes here. We're almost out of time.
No. I've got so many more questions for you, Felipe. We'll have to get back up again. One of the questions I am super curious about is, as I process, we're at my shop, we're still in the process of we're getting it in our ICU with our ICU brethren. They're kind of getting their credentialing all done. We're working on getting it into our shop. One of the big questions I've always had, and I haven't found a lot of great data on it, is the kind of safety profile of defibrillation. Intra-arrest TEE probe is in place. Have you ever had any episodes of actually harming the machine or injury to the patient, delivering your external shock? I know there's like a 2006 paper where they actually talk about on large patients potentially delivering a shock from inside via the TEE probe. But any knowledge on your end for data about that?
Yeah, for sure. The short answer is that no, I haven't had any problems, and I'm not aware of any of the folks that are part of this large consortium that we have, the ResusTEE project, collaborative in the registry, who have had that problem. We've done over 500 cases of TEE in cardiac arrest, and we're tracking complications, and I'm not aware of anything related to defibrillation. With that said, it's sort of a weird study to do, and there's no formal data. And this is why probably many of the ultrasound companies, the makers of these devices, don't go out of their way to endorse the use. With that said, we are studying this in our lab. We're collecting data from an animal lab. We're purposefully, first of all, holding the probe during the defibrillation to confirm that you won't get electrocuted. And spoiler alert, I haven't. And and to confirm that the probe also in the machine doesn't get damaged. So we're hoping to report that. With that said, this is one of those things where all you need to do is to look outside our tribe, almost always the right answer or where the answer lies. Our friends, colleagues from electrophysiology and cardiology do TEEs on a regular basis in patients that are getting defibrillated repeatedly doing EP procedures. And it is standard to have the probe in place, and in many of those cases, and it's not a problem. If you then think about it from a sort of technical standpoint, the probe is sealed electrically. In fact, you do a test called leak test after each use, and that test confirms that there's no passage of electricity in or out of the device. It needs to be sealed. Any endoscopic device needs to be electrically sealed. And so if that is the case, then there shouldn't be any problem when you're defibrillating or cardioverting. But it's one of those things that it will take probably some time for us to sort of come around and really establish definitively if that's the case.
Sure.
I'm taking one for the team and defibrillating all the patients holding the probe to make sure that we can demonstrate it.